This video is an example of how to use arrays in Java. So we're going to solve this exercise right here, the first one. Write a Java program that asks the user how many numbers they want to enter, create an array of double, prompt the user for each value, and then store those values in the array. When the user is finished, display the unsorted array, sort the array, display the sorted array, and the total and the average of the numbers entered. Use methods to calculate the sum of the averages. Okay, so let's go ahead and just copy this, and we'll paste it in on our JDoodle, just so we have the assignment in front of us. We're going to come over here to JDoodle. We're going to start a new project. I like to start with an example just because it gets me some of the boilerplate, the class and the main method definition, so that I don't have to write those myself. Let's go ahead and put in our the challenge up here. We'll need to paginate that a little bit. We're just doing this so that we have the specs of the problem we're trying to solve on this screen, so we don't have to flip back and forth. Okay, so it's a couple of things. Let's read it again. Create an array of double, prompt the user for each value, and store them on the array. So we're going to need a way to prompt the user for how many they want to enter, and then we're going to have so we're going to need to get a positive integer from the user, and then we're going to want to get create an array of double, and then we're going to want a for loop to prompt the user for doubles to fill that array. So we're going to need a method to get a double value. Then when the user is finished, we're going to display the array. We'll use the toString method on the array. We'll sort it using the sort method on the array. Then we'll display the sorted array, and then we'll do total and average, and we'll write methods to do total and average. Okay, so first thing is we're going to need a scanner. So let's go ahead and put in our import for the scanner. We're going to need to import the arrays as well, but we'll come back and do that in a minute. Okay, first thing that we have is we want to, let's go ahead and create the scanner, and then we want to prompt the user for the number of values that they want to enter. Okay, so scanner. Okay, there's our scanner. We've done that a bunch of times so far. Okay, so now we need to get a positive integer. So I'm going to do that with a method. Because to get a positive integer, I want to do input validation. I want to make sure that you enter a valid integer. And then I'll use a try-catch block around the parseInt to do that. And I'm going to want to make sure that it's greater than, that is 1 or greater. So greater than or equal to 1. Because, we can't have negative values in an array. You can't have zero elements in an array or negative elements in an array. So we're going to need to make sure that we get a value that's a positive integer. So let's write a method to do that. We're going to get int, we'll call it length equals get positive int. And that'll take 2 parameters. We'll send the scanner, and then we'll send a prompt. Let's see, how many numbers will you enter? Okay, so that's going to be our prompt. Now I've called this method before I've written it. I do this because I want to make sure that I have all the parameters defined, and that I know how my method's going to work, etc. So now I want to go ahead and create this method. So to create the method, I'm going to do a new public static definition. So got to be really careful where I put this. You got to make sure that it's still inside the class, so it's in between the opening and closing block for the class, but it's outside the opening and closing block for the main method. So I'm going to be very careful where I place it. And I'm going to put a blank line in between the main method just so that it's easier for me to read. Public static, the return type is going to be int. The name is going to be get positive int. It's going to take 2 parameters. One's going to be a scanner, and one's going to be a string that we'll call prompt. Okay. We've seen this before in one other assignment. This get positive int, we're going to have a get positive int, a get int, a get double. We're going to have these methods we're going to use over and over and over again for the duration of this class. And so we don't have to write them every time. We can, once we get them written in subsequent weeks, we can just go and grab that code from our previous assignments and include it in here. But we are going to use these get positive int, get int, get double, etc. We're going to use these over and over again. Okay, so let's go ahead and write this out. So this is, in order to do this, we need an input validation loop. This is a standard pattern that we're going to see. The pattern consists of a while true loop that prompts the user to enter some data, attempts to validate that data. If it's valid, it returns it, thus ending the while true loop. If it's not valid, it prints out a message saying why, and then loops back and we start over again. So let's write that. While true, this is a input validation loop. This is, you'll see this pattern over and over and over again. Just about every program we write is going to have some kind of input validation loop. First, we put out the prompt to tell the user what we want them to do. Next, we collect a string input from the user using the scanner. Now, some of you have used the next int or the next double options on the scanner here. Those are fine if you don't need input validation, but if you need input validation, you need to use the next line and do your validation by hand. So now we're going to, we want to verify that the input is a valid integer using the integer parse int method. And that can throw an exception if it's not a valid integer. So we're going to use a try catch block. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill out the try catch just so that we have all of our blocks and parentheses and all that are all in place. Okay, so I want to, getting these blocks and these curly braces and the parentheses and everything lined up is crucially important. If they're not lined up, the code can get messy and it's hard to read and you can start making mistakes. So you always want to make sure you do that first. Keep your code nice and clean. Now what we want to do is we want to prompt for the we want to try to, we've already prompted and we've collected a piece of data from the user. We want to see if that's a valid integer. So I'm going to say int value equals integer dot parse int, and we're going to parse the input. Okay, if that fails, I'm going to come down to the catch block. Now I'm going to get a number format exception. Okay, and if it fails, I'm just going to print a message that says that's not a valid integer. Okay. All right. So let's try to run this. We've written a bunch of code. We're not done yet, but we've written a bunch of code and we should compile it and execute it to make sure we haven't made any typing mistakes or anything like that. Because if I've misspelled something or I've done something wrong, then we want to know about it right now. So it looks like it's compiled. Okay. So let's go ahead. How many numbers will we enter? So I can test that if I enter an invalid integer. Okay, then that's fine. If I enter a valid integer, then it should take it. Now, I haven't actually finished, right? So I'm stuck in an infinite loop here. So also notice if I enter a negative number here, this should be invalid, but the code appears to be accepting that because I haven't written any logic to prevent that yet. Okay, so let's stop that execution and come back here. So we're back here right inside the try block. So once I have once I know this value is a valid integer, then I can test it to see if it's greater than 0. If value is greater than 0 means that it is at least 1. 0 is not a valid input. 1 is valid, so -1 is not valid. So anything that's greater than 0 is valid. So if that's the case, then I'll return the value. Otherwise, I'll print out a message that says you got to enter a positive number. Okay. All right. So let's try that. So now our loop to collect the number of values that we want to enter should work. So invalid input here is protected. It's not going to cause our program to fail. Negative inputs won't work. So if I'm going to enter 5, that should work. Now at this point, the program will stop because I've prompted for this number, but I haven't done anything with it. Okay, so now we can write the rest of our code. Okay, so let's keep going. So now that I'm back up here in the main on line 12. Now that I have the number of numbers that the user is going to enter, I want to create an array. So we're going to get doubles. Let's say double. This is going to be double array. So this is So I'm using the double data type, but I'm saying it's going to be an array. So this means that the data type is double array, and that's a double with open square brackets and closed square brackets right on it. Okay. And I'm going to say the array is going to be called numbers, and it's going to equal new double array of size length. Okay. So there we go. So we have a data type of double array. We're going to call it numbers. We're going to use the new keyword because we have to use new when we're creating an array because we're creating an instance of an array. And then we're going to say it's a double array and it has this many elements. Whatever the user enters, that's how many elements we want. Okay. So now we have the array. So now we want to prompt the user to enter double values to put in the array. So for that, we're going to need a for loop. So we're going to write a pretty standard for loop. We're going to use the I counter. Now here we want to start at 0 because the elements in the array are numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We want to our index counter for our for loop to also be numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to start the for loop at 0. And then we're going to set the exit condition for the for loop to be as long as I is less than numbers.length, then continue. And at the end of each iteration, increment I by 1. So numbers.length, so we start at 0, we do I less than numbers.length. So if we choose 5 here, then we want the values of I to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, because arrays are indexed starting at 0. So there is no index 5. Even though there's 5 elements in the array, there is no index 5. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we want to make sure that our for loop starting at 0 and ending at 4, which this will do. And then we go ahead and put in our blocks. So now I've got the block, this opening and closing curly braces on the for loop. I want to take a moment here and just pause. The 3 most common mistakes you'll make in Java are missing semicolons, misspelled words. So you're going to misspell the name of a method. You're going to misspell the name of a variable. You're going to misspell a keyword. Or sometimes in capitalization counts as a misspelling. So if you use improper capitalization, that's a misspelling in Java. The other, and those 2 things are pretty easy to fix because the compiler can usually pick those 2 things out. Missing semicolons and undefined symbols usually come out pretty easily from the compiler. The third most common mistake is for the blocks to be unbalanced. The third most common mistake is for these blocks to be unbalanced. So the blocks are, of course, the pieces of code that are in between the curly braces. So we have lots of blocks being defined here. Here's a block for the class. Between these 2 values, here's a block for main. Here's a block for the for loop. So getting those blocks out of order or putting code inside a block where it doesn't belong, like for instance, if this definition of this gets positive int was inside the block of the public static void main, that's going to cause an error, and you're going to get something cryptic. It's going to be things like, the compiler will just say, I ran out of code and I don't know what to do, right? So I got to the end of the code, and because the blocks are out of line, there's, the program doesn't look like it's complete, or you'll get an invalid definition. You can't, if you try to define a method inside another method, that will come back as an invalid definition or an out of place definition. So you'll get error messages that can seem a little cryptic, but if you get those, it's typically because your blocks are out of alignment. So you got to really pay a lot of attention to keeping those blocks in line. The indentation goes a long way on helping with the blocks. Notice how I'm keeping all this code nicely indented. And I'm dealing with my blocks first. Before I write any code, I'm making sure that my blocks are lined up and that my indentation is correct. That is paramount in being able to read this code and find where I've made an error. If my code is all jumbled and my indentation is not any good, then it's going to be really hard for me to debug when I get my blocks out of sequence. Okay, so we've got a for loop here that we've defined. Now that we have the for loop, we want to prompt the user to enter a double value. So I'm going to do that I'm going to write a get double method, and I'm just going to store that. I'm going to say numbers at I equals get double. And it's going to be just like the get positive int method, but it's going to get a double instead. So it's going to take scanner and it's going to take a prompt. Let's see, let's say enter number And we'll give them a little code there so they can decide they know what kind of number we're looking for. Okay. So now we've got a get double. We've called the method, but we need to define it. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to put it in between main and get positive end. I like for my methods, I like for my main method to be first in the class. And then I like all of my other methods to be in the class in alphabetical order. So if I have 20 or 30 of them, then they're easy to find. So get double, it's going to be public static double. The return type is double. The method is called get double. Takes two parameters. One is a scanner, and the other one is a string called the prompt. This is going to look a lot like the get int, except it's going to get a double instead. But it's going to be nearly identical to the get positive int. It's an input validation loop, so I do while true. I do my prompt. Then I'm going to collect my input. Okay, I've misspelled string. That's a misspelling mistake. Should be uppercase. Okay, now that it's I have a value, I need to try to parse it. So I need a try catch block. Let's go ahead and put in the catch while we're at it. The catch is going to be number format exception. Okay, I've misspelled exception. Notice how it didn't turn red? That's my editor telling me I've made a mistake. See how it's red down here on line 40? I've misspelled exception. There we go. Okay. All right, so now my blocks are in place for my try catch. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to parse this. I'm going to say, I'm just going to say return double dot, because I'm just going to return it straight off because I don't need to test anything else about it. Down here in get positive int, we wanted to test that it was a positive an integer. Then we wanted to do a second validation to test that it was positive. I don't need to do that here. So I can just try to do the parse right on the return statement. And then if it fails, my catch will be executed and we'll do the input validation again. Parse double input. Now, if what the user entered is a valid double value, it's going to be returned back to main, and we'll continue. Otherwise, here's an error message: system.out println. That is not a valid number. Okay, let's see if that works. So now what should happen is we should be prompted for how many numbers do you want to enter, and then we'll have a loop to enter that many numbers. Okay. Now, one of the advantages of running my code and testing it as I write it is that I don't need to test this piece of the code anymore. I know that my logic for collecting the number of numbers that the user is going to enter, I know that works. I know the input validation is there. I know it's passing all the rules, so I don't need to test this anymore. So I can just keep working right into it. So we get into 3. Now here I can do a little test. If I put in gibberish, I should get a message that says that's not a valid number. Or I can enter a valid number. In this case, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, so I'm going to enter 12.4. That should work. Enter a number. I'll do an integer. That should work because all integers can be converted into doubles. And let's do a big one: 100, 1,000, bunch of numbers. Okay. And that's it. Okay, so now we're collecting our numbers and we're putting them in an array. So now what we want to do is we come back up to the top. It says, so when the user is finished, display the unsorted array, then sort the array and display the sorted array, and then the total and average of the numbers entered. Okay. So, and we're going to want a method to do the sum of the average. Okay, so let's go ahead and display the array. So there we're going to use the array.toString and the arrays.sort method. So first thing we need to do is import the arrays. Import java.util.arrays. Now we're importing the arrays class so that we can use the wrapper method to work on arrays. The wrapper method is very similar to the integer and the double wrapper methods here that we're using in these lines, line 26, line 38. The wrapper method for arrays just provides some extra functionality for arrays. It's not included by default because it's not a primitive data type. So integer and integer and double are really common used in just about every program, and so they're always going to be. You don't have to include those. But for the arrays wrapper class, you need to do an import, which we did. Import java.util.arrays. Okay, so now let's go ahead and print it out. So the first thing we just wanted to use the toString method. And we're going to say numbers. We're going to say arrays dot toString and numbers. So this is, we're calling the toString method of the arrays wrapper class, and we're sending it this parameter, this argument of numbers. Looks a lot like this parse double, right? Only the output here is going to be a string value that's going to have all the values in the array comma delimited. Okay, let's go ahead and run that and see if it works. Oh, I've made a mistake. Cannot find symbol system.out. So I've misspelled print line here on line 18. See that? Line 18, misspelled print line. I left out the T. Okay. Let's go ahead and execute that. Okay, I'm going to enter 3. And I'm just going to do these real quick. Okay, and so this is the toString. So we see those are the numbers we entered: 12, 10.6, minus 1.3. Let's go back here to line 19, and let's sort the array. Now remember, when we sort the array, it actually changes the array. So it's not creating a new array, and I don't need to store it in a new variable. So remember that once I sort the array, I can't get the old array back. So before you sort it, make sure that it's really okay that that you're changing the order of the array. So we're going to sort it. And then we're just going to print it out again. So I'm just going to cut and paste this line because it's the same line. So now the first one will be the raw array, the way that the user entered the numbers. Then we're going to sort it. And then the last one will be the sorted value of that. So let's do that. We'll test that, and then we'll do the sum and the average. 3 numbers. 12.3. I'm going to enter them out of order to make sure that we're actually seeing a change. Okay, so there's our sorted array. Unsorted and then sorted. Looks pretty good. Okay, let's do the sum. I'm just going to do a system.out. I'm going to do a printf here because when I sum these up, I'm going to want to just do 2. I'm going to round the sum to 2 decimal positions. So since we're dealing with double, it's always good habit to be thoughtful about how many decimal precision we want, how much decimal precision we want in the output. So we'll just say the sum is, and I use a format string here. I want 1,000 separator. I want 2 decimal points, and it's going to be a floating point number. And since it's printf, we're going to do a new line at the end. Okay. And then my replacement value for this formatting code is going to be, let's call it array sum numbers. Okay, so I've called another method. Okay, now if I try to run this, my method's not gonna work. Okay, because I haven't, it says this class cannot find symbol. This array sum is not defined yet. So this is because I haven't written. So let's go ahead and write that. So public static. This is going to be a double because I'm summing an array of doubles. So the result of that is going to be a double. Public static double array sum. It takes 1 parameter, which is a double array. And we'll just call it numbers. We'll just use the same name as the main. Even though it's the same name variable, it's 2 different variables. Okay. So get my blocks lined up there. Open block, close block. Make sure I do that. Make sure that it's in the right place, that it's inside the main class, but not inside any of the other methods. And then this is just going to be an enhanced for loop. Let's see, first we have to define our aggregator variable, which is going to be double. Double sum equals 0.0. Okay. And then we do an enhanced for loop. So the enhanced for loop, instead of doing for I equals 0, I less than length, I can just say for, this is essentially a for each loop. In Java, they call it an enhanced for loop. In other languages, it would be called a for each. This is going to be a for loop, and for each iteration of the for loop, I'm going to use this variable double number in numbers. So I read this as saying for each number in numbers, do this value. Sum, do this logic. Sum plus equals number. So this is just an aggregator function. And then when it's done, we just return sum. All right, let's run that. I'm going to enter 3 numbers. We could enter 10 or 15 or 30 here, but for the sake of time, I'm doing 3 at a time. So let's see. So let's enter some ones with a lot of decimal precision. So we know that our raw and sorting is working, so we don't need to verify that. And we could add this up by hand, but 76 minus 12 plus 9, 73, that's about right. Okay, so we feel pretty good on that. And notice that we've rounded this down to 2 decimal points because we've got a lot of decimal precision up here. So we're just trying to clean that up. Last thing is we want the average. So let's go ahead and do that system. That's going to be very similar to the sum, only it's going to be average instead. So printf, we're going to say average. Oop, made a spelling mistake there. We're going to say average is percent comma 0.2 f percent n. So it's basically the same as the sum line, only instead of calling a sum, I'm going to call the array average. Okay. And then we're going to create that and see how I'm keeping my methods in alphabetical order here. You can put them in whatever order you want. I like them in alphabetical order. So I'm going to write the signature to my method, double array, numbers. Okay. I misspelled double, so let me fix that. It's called array average. Now, how do you calculate the average? To calculate the average, you calculate the sum, and then you divide by the number of items in the list. Okay. Now, typically when calculating an average, you would have to do input validation to make sure that the length of the array is not 0. Because if you try to divide by 0, you're going to get an error. In this case, I don't have to worry about that because I know that in my main method, I have a number greater than 0. So I don't have to worry about doing that validation here. But sometimes you do have to be careful. So I already know how to calculate the sum of the array because I wrote a method to do it right here called array sum. So I don't need to write that again. I can just call that same method. Then I want to divide that sum by the length of the numbers array. That's the number of elements in the array. So I can do that on one line. I don't need much logic here. So I'm just going to do a return array sum of numbers divided by numbers.length. All right, that should do it. How many numbers will we enter? Let's do 3 again. 12.34. 175. And a third number, 1.3. Unsorted, sorted with sum and average. Okay. All right. So that's it. That's the example of using arrays, using in the enhanced for loop, and writing some methods to operate on arrays. Last thing we want to do is make sure we save this. So we're going to save this as array processing example. Always make sure you save your work. All right. That's it for this example.